Hello, good afternoon everyone. I think it's just about afternoon. It's a really great pleasure to be here with Nicholas Coleridge, the very distinguished novelist and biographer, and to talk to him about his new book, Ian Fleming, The Complete Man. Now, as the introduction said, I actually quite a few years ago now wrote a book, a sort of partial biography of Ian Fleming based on his life in Jamaica at his house Goldeneye, where he wrote the Bond book. So it was with particular interest that I picked up Nicholas's book, and as I've said to you, Nicholas, I was pretty much blown away by it. The amazing research, such wide-ranging research, the beautiful, elegant writing, and somewhat to my surprise, the real emotional impact. This is a really moving book. Now, we've had a few chats over the last couple of days, and one thing that sort of struck me was when you said you weren't really an avid fan of either the Bond films or the Bond books, but now you've written what is definitely going to be known as the definitive biography of Ian Fleming. So how did that project come about?
Could I first correct that I'm not Nicholas Coleridge?
Did I say that?
who is...
That was yesterday's gig.
A very nice man who I was at university with, who I hope gets often mistaken for Nicholas Shakespeare. I'm a novelist before a biographer, and I was writing a novel in Tasmania about 4 years ago, when suddenly I was approached by the Fleming family with this interesting idea. They wanted to do a new authorized biography, the second one since 1966, and would I be interested? And I confess my first thought was flattery, but at the same time, I wasn't a fully paid up member of the Ian Fleming fan club or the Bond fan club. I'd grown up on Bond like most of my baby boomer generation and read the books under blue blankets with torches and seen the films and enjoyed them. I wasn't anti them. But I was more admiring of his elder brother Peter, who'd been a very brave officer in the Norway campaign in 1940. And looking at Ian Fleming from sideways glances, I got this kind of image, a tabloid Daily Mail image of a kind of wife-beating, sadist, pompous old Etonian who was quite haughty and had written these books which his wife didn't really like, and he would creep back from the golf club past her famous friends to his bedroom and go to sleep with his blanket over his head, trying to ignore the sniggers of these overeducated people on the floor below. And I suppose I realized what the moral of the story is only a few weeks ago, that if you don't run off with the wife of the owner of the Daily Mail if you want to not be forever after rendered into tabloid fat, which I think is what's happened. And that was the image I had of Ian Fleming when I was approached. So I said, give me 2 months to do some due diligence, and then I'll make a decision. And in those 2 months, I found two things about him. The first was that he was the word kindness came up again and again from the women he'd slept with and had affairs with, who kept on loving him, from the males in his circle who he had known all his life. This word kind, again and again. And kindness was not a characteristic I had associated with 007. And it's a very interesting characteristic for a biographer to kind of, that began to twinkle to me as something that I could retrieve and examine. And the woman who bought him Goldeneye, called Maud Russell, with whom he had an affair during the war, she writes in her unpublished diary 7 years after his death, I think continuously of Ian, and above all, his gentleness and kindness. The second thing I discovered was he was a lot more important than I had imagined. I mean, the image has grown of him, again, fostered probably by the Daily Mail, that during the war, he was just nothing more than in charge of in-trays, out-trays, and ashtrays, and that he wrote Bond in a way to compensate for an unimportant war career. I'd bought that in as much as I knew anything about it, and I started to dig, and I tracked down people who had known him in the war, and
can we get onto that in a second?
Okay, yes.
I just want to. One of the interesting things you said about the women's reaction to him, and there was a sort of certainly with more, there was a sort of slightly mothering feel, wasn't there? Now you tell at the end of the book the very tragic story of his son Caspar, which I hope we'll have time to get onto. And you sort of summarize that, or maybe explain it. You say, one wounded child creating another. So in what way, from his background or his upbringing, was Ian a wounded child?
Well, he was the son of privilege, but the grandson of poverty. So his grandfather was born in a slum in Dundee. And I went back with Ian's nephew to this slum. Extraordinary. The father owns £1 a week as a jute merchant. And Robert Fleming rises to become one of the richest men in Europe. He kind of creates the Scottish-American bond market, finances all the railways in the States using the wealth of the jute manufacturers from Dundee. And then he builds a house in London on what becomes the site of the American Embassy, where J.F. Kennedy and his father are kind of there, based in the late 30s. And a big estate near Henley with 44 bedrooms and 27 gardeners. So Fleming himself grew up with this grandfather who was colossally wealthy. But by the terms of the grandfather's will, when Fleming's father dies, Fleming's only 8 when his father dies in the First World War. He's killed by a shell in France. And
can you just say sort of how the news is given to Ian and what happens in the immediate aftermath of that?
In those days, you're summoned by the headmaster of your prep school and tell your father's dead, and you're not given a single. You don't go home. You don't go and recuperate. I mean,
so he just went back to his boarding school.
He just went back to his boarding school, aged 8, and suddenly his elder brother, who's also at the boarding school, becomes the father of the family. So that sets up a real tension for the rest of his life. He gets on with his brother, but the brother becomes incredibly successful in many areas, not only in writing. He becomes an overnight success, a kind of Byronic figure in the 1930s when he writes Brazilian Adventure and News from Tartary. He's also very important in the war. He becomes private secretary to the head of British intelligence, and he's sent to Norway and then to India, and he's in charge of intelligence in Delhi for the rest of the war.
And his shadow hangs over Ian when Ian's at Eton, and maybe it contributes to the failure of his time at Eton and the subsequent failures. I mean, up until the war, it's this sort of catalogue of failure, isn't it, for him?
I mean, so at Eton, suddenly he goes to Eton, where his brother is and where his father had been, and the brother's winning all the prizes, and Ian's not doing very well in class, and so Ian is pushed into adopting the role of being a black sheep. Probably he wasn't as black sheepish as he naturally was. He's probably fleece was a bit whiter or grayer, but he's pushed into opposition to his brother, and he's kind of leaves Eton a term early. He then goes to study at Sandhurst to be a soldier like his father. He gets
that was very much on the prompting of his mother.
His
Eve,
mother. His mother's
who seems to be a very interesting character.
His mother's a kind of nightmare figure, very beautiful, very snobbish, and controls her 4 sons' lives, wants to tell them where to go on holidays, who to have as girlfriends, and completely disapproves of all their girlfriends. I mean, she wants her sons to marry the Princess Royal or something. And Ian's in constant battle throughout his life with his mother, and kind of ends up, when he's 43, kind of marrying an equivalent of his mother, Anne Rothermere, the wife then of the owner of the Daily Mail. But there's a catalogue of disasters after he leaves Eton. He joins the army, and then he gets a venereal disease. He has to leave Sandhurst. He's then sent by his mother to Europe, to Austria, to try and study for the Foreign Office. He discovers girls. He loves the Austrian women. They love him. And he then goes to Geneva to work for the League of Nations, where his boss is a man called Sir Eric Drummond, whose code name in the First World War was Bond. And so there are all these kind of small trails that will lead, the kind of gunpowder trails that will lead eventually when he's 42. He doesn't start writing Bond until he's 42, by which time his kind of interesting life is over.
So he sort of failed at Sandhurst. He failed as a stockbroker. He was the world's worst stockbroker, I think someone called him. He fails to get into the Foreign Office. But then the war comes along, and I think you write in the book that this caused the warring characters who had been Ian Fleming to coalesce into a substantial and coherent young man. So could you explain sort of how that happened, and actually sort of a few details of what he actually did in the war?
One thing he did before becoming the worst stockbroker, he worked for Reuters, and he loved that, and it trained him into writing short, sharp sentences, always to be accurate, and he was sent quite young to Moscow, and he witnessed the trial of 6 English engineers. There was a show trial of Stalin's, and the kind of presiding judge, who was really eminently evil Bond villain called Vyshinsky, you can see that already Fleming's idea of evil is incarnated in this man, who he bumps up to again in New York. So, but Reuters was a very important. He wanted to come back after the war, one day and own Reuters. He loved the whole quickness of the reporting and where it sent him and the access to power. So that's quite important, and it was why he was probably chosen in 1939 by the head of naval intelligence, a man called Admiral Godfrey, to be his personal assistant. And I think one of the clinching things about Godfrey was looking for a man who thought outside the box, who knew about banking, who knew about journalism. And so Fleming, although he led a kind of playboy existence, ticked all these boxes. But for me, the clinching thing is that Godfrey didn't get on very well with his brilliant elder brother. And I think he probably detected in Ian a fellow second son who he could kind of be compassionate towards. And it was the most fortuitous meeting. Ian Fleming was very good at seducing old men with charm and everything. He seduced Godfrey, and they remained friends for the rest of his life. But Godfrey kind of basically hands over the task of naval intelligence.
Can you sort of say a little bit more about what that is? What we're actually doing day by day in working for naval intelligence?
So in 1939, September, the only intelligence service working in England is the naval intelligence, because all the ships are at sea. So suddenly, Ian is literally under. Churchill is in the room above as First Sea Lord. So Fleming, from his desk, I've actually traced the kind of trajectory, and you can hear the steps in the room above. Churchill was a great friend of his father, had written his father's obituary in the Times, and had been used to shoot at the Fleming estate near Oxford. So Fleming always slightly worshipped Churchill, and he is allowed. He rewrites all Churchill's memos, he sends memos, he drafts the memos from the naval intelligence, and then he's given kind of latitude, because he throws up ideas such as Operation Mincemeat was one of his ideas. He's encouraged to use his imagination, and this is suddenly, all through the 30s, his imagination had got him into so much trouble. In the war, it's the real thing that allows him to connect different sections. I mean, he's got his finger in every single intelligence pie. He's setting up the propaganda unit with Sefton Delmer. He's helping to get the topographical unit, where he's suggesting the BBC tells everybody to send in postcards and photographs of their holidays in France, so you can then see what the coastline looks like. These are all Fleming ideas. But probably the most important idea he had, I mean, to preface this, he's so much more important than his fellow intelligence novelists like Graham Greene or John le Carré, who were on the very, very minor fringes of intelligence. I mean, le Carré was a tiny cog in Hamburg compared with Ian Fleming, who was in the inner sanctum of British intelligence. And he and his brother were 2 of only 30 people who were ultra cleared in April 1940. You know, they got the decrypts of all the codes from the Enigma machines that went to Bletchley Park. And every 2 weeks, Fleming is going to Bletchley. I mean, this is a very, very high-ranking intelligence officer. And he sets up a commando unit called 30AU, which he intends to grab German and enemy ciphers and Enigma machines with the front troops. And it grows to about 400 people by the end of the war. And these are known as Fleming's commandos. And so much of this is secret. They weren't allowed to talk about what they did. Most of the papers were burnt after the war. But I had an extraordinary piece of luck.
Incredible. One of the many incredible interviews that are in this book. And what a hard man that you met.
I found there was one surviving member of this unit, a Royal Marine called Bill Marshall. And I rang him up, and he sounded totally compos mentis, and he was about 95. And I said, can I come and see you next Wednesday? He said, yes, yes. So I turn up, but I turn up 2 days. He was expecting me kind of the following week. And so he wasn't expecting me at all when I turned up. And he was a bit gruff. But anyway, we then had 5 hours in which he was like a lightning rod back into the past. And without him, I wouldn't have fully understood the nature of 30 AU. And he'd met Fleming in France after the fall of France. He'd then gone into Germany and dug up the secrets of the German scientist Wolfgang, called I can't remember what his one of the top. He'd invented this fuel for rockets, and he had a whole fuel factory. And here is Bill Marshall telling me how he went into the bedroom, he took the hair ribbons off the bed of Wolfgang's daughters, and his daughter had them. He had a tin of shoe polish made out of skin from the concentration camps. I mean, he was telling me these extraordinary details, and I thought this was one of the kind of key bits to understanding how important Fleming had been. Anyway, he dies 5 days later, and had I turned up on the day I was meant to see him, all that would have been lost.
So at the end of the war, it sort of made him, but the end is slightly anticlimactic, isn't it? And he sort of misses those days, and he has no sort of reward, no public reward for it. Is he a bit of a lost soul when the war ends?
I think this is when he becomes the complete man in the war. Every single fiber of his being is brought into kind of responsibility and interest and curiosity, and he's given a kind of complete latitude to it. The one other thing I should mention is that he helped set up the Foreign American Intelligence Service in 1941. He's one of only 2 or 3 people involved. The Americans at that moment did not have a foreign intelligence service, and the British were desperate to get the Americans in on their side. And Fleming is one of the small group of people who helped American called William Donovan to set up what became the OSS, and then in 1947 became the CIA. And he really, the special relationship between England and America, which everyone bangs on about, is essentially an intelligence relationship, and essentially Fleming is one of the kind of handful of people who created that bond. Anyway, after the war, he's suddenly demobbed. He's not given a medal, but I think that's quite normal for people in intelligence. He was offered a job, and I think this is where you begin to see where Bond is beginning. He's offered a job. April 1945, he's one of the few people who is contributing to the Bland report about the future of British intelligence. And he's predicting drones, he's predicting crises in the Suez Canal, he's predicting, the one thing he doesn't predict correctly is that China's navy won't be very important. But he's helping to set up the post-war intelligence system for the British. And he's then offered a job in this, quite high up. And he debates about whether to take it, and then suddenly decides, no, I want to go to Jamaica, I want to live in the sun for 2 months of the year, I want to write. And he gets the offer of a job at the Sunday Times to run the foreign paper, all the coverage for the Sunday Times and about 20 other newspapers belonging to Lord Kemsley. And so here he becomes the kind of Reuters owner that he'd hoped to be 10 years before when he worked for Reuters. He kind of uses these journalists as spies. Many of them are recruited from British intelligence and naval intelligence, and they report back to him kind of sit reps, and he sends these onto the British intelligence. So he's a kind of monitoring the Cold War. Now the Russians are the enemy, not the Germans. And he's hoping during those 5 years that he's going to become more important as a kind of newspaper man, as a central cog in intelligence. But actually, his owner of the newspapers isn't interested in this. It's too much money to fund this. And it's in these circumstances that I think what happens is that he tries to realize what would Fleming himself have done if he'd stayed on in that job in intelligence and kind of helped to run British intelligence. And I think that's where Bond becomes the vehicle for experimenting on all these operations, many of which were based on operations Fleming himself had conceived in the Second World War against the Nazis. And he just reconceives them, he dresses them up for a Cold War setting. And similarly, I think the sex that Bond has with anyone he encounters is not quite as forward-thinking as possibly we might have imagined. I mean, people think, oh God, he's predicting the swinging 60s. I think all he's doing is reheating up the incredible hot atmosphere of the Blitz, where everybody's jumping into bed with everybody else because it's their last day on Earth. And so the Blitz is a very exciting period to look at what he's doing behind the scenes with lots of girlfriends he has.
And of course, one of his dearest girlfriends, Muriel, is killed in the Blitz. And this is a sort of a pattern of sort of misfortune in his romantic life, rather than if we can separate that from his sex life. And obviously in the Bond films, Bond always gets the girl, and then slightly baffling. I remember as a youngster being slightly baffled that in the next film that girl seems to have disappeared and he's a bachelor again, and I wasn't sure what happened to these lovely women. But it is different for Fleming. And you talk about sort of Jamaica, and he went there in the war, obviously, and with his friend Ivor Bryce, and made this resolution to come back after the war, build a house, and swim in the sea and write books. And he does that after the war, and he goes there once a year with his amazing deal with his job with Kemsley. But it isn't until 1952 that he sits down and he writes that famous first line of Casino Royale: the sweat, the scent, the sweat, the smoke of a casino at 3 a.m. is nauseating. And then this sort of launches this sort of juggernaut, doesn't it? And by the time of his death, there's something like 30 million copies have been sold of his books, translated into 18 languages. And it's a slow start, but it's a phenomenal achievement. And as a writer myself, and I'm sure there's writers and aspiring writers here who would love to sell 30 million copies, what were the factors, and there's several, aren't there? What are the factors that made him such a successful commercial novelist?
I think he's got a very good product to begin with, in that he knows how to write through Reuters. He knows how to write these quick sentences, be accurate. Pace is very important for him. He learns from Ambler and Graham Greene, and he writes very, very quickly. This was something I discovered. My grandfather was a teacher and a broadcaster, and had taught Alec Waugh how to write when he was at school. And Alec Waugh then told Ian Fleming my grandfather's tips. And so I love to think that I've got a tiny little link through my family connection. The real tip was to write 2,000 words every morning and never deviate from that discipline. And it doesn't matter how good the stuff is or how bad it is, don't look back at the text. And it was only when he would take the manuscript to his friend Claire Blanchard in New York that he would kind of read the manuscript for the first time with her. But that gave him an incredible pace. So he wanted you to turn the pages like following a kind of a ski behind a boat. And so the second thing is that he knew what he was writing about. So all these books are underpinned by knowledge that was hard-earned in the naval intelligence, and often based on people's lives that he had to send to their death, or on stories he'd heard about, that he was privileged to hear about other people's exploits. I mean, people say, who is Bond based on? I mean, there are more kind of possibilities than Bond are based on that would staff his regiment 30 AU. I mean, every single person he come across who was quite brave immediately claims that they were kind of the basis for Bond. And I think essentially it was based on him and his exploits and what he'd heard. And the luck he has, he gets married. He doesn't want to get married, but his girlfriend, who becomes his wife, is pregnant a second time with his child. She'd lost the first time when she's married to Rothermere. And one of the kind of extraordinary discoveries is that Rothermere did not know that his wife's child was Fleming's, and he thought his own children from his previous wife were illegitimate, and he is deciding that if the new child is a boy, he's going to give the Daily Mail to this child. So in a kind of curious way, Fleming would have become a newspaper proprietor had that child lived. Anne Rothermere gets pregnant again. She leaves with Fleming, she leaves Rothermere, and in a sense, the uprightness in Fleming, he's got to marry her now, because everyone knows that this is his child.
And so all their friends are advising strongly against this, aren't they?
Every single person tells him he mustn't marry her. She will be a disaster, which in many respects she will be. But it's 4 weeks before he's going to get married. He's been told by Kemsley, don't come back unless you're married, to his office job. And it's in these circumstances he sits down, and that first sentence, you say, comes out, and it all comes out in about 6 weeks.
Yeah, every time he's asked, isn't it, in his career, which all authors get asked, I suppose, and I actually asked you earlier, so I'm guilty of this, is, so what inspired you to write? He says, the ghastly spectre of matrimony, which must have pleased Anne greatly to hear that.
Well, the problem is, when she read the book, he wanted to dedicate Casino Royale to her, and if you see it now, you look into the glare of a blank page, because she didn't want such a horrible, sadistic book to be dedicated to her. And I think that hurt him quite a bit, because she thought all this time he was writing a masterpiece, a kind of to go alongside those books of her friends, Evelyn Waugh and Peter Quinnell and Cyril Connolly and Paddy Lee Fermer. And he's writing this book that he's been writing for 4 years, and only one paragraph remains, and it's a completely diabolical attempt to write a kind of Joycean novel. And so she's thinking this is what he's writing in Goldeneye, and then she reads Casino Royale and she's horrified. But one of the things that the book doesn't do that well. I mean, he manages to fix all the reviews through the Sunday Times connections.
Yeah. There's a lot of sort of important connections. He works his contacts.
He's absolutely brilliant.
I mean, with his jobs as well, it's a real sort of opening, a sort of lid opening on the British establishment as it was then, and I'm sure isn't now, where it's sort of mates scratching each other's backs. So that's another sort of recommendation to sell 30 million copies, is know all the lit heads and have favours and all that kind of thing.
I mean, what's extraordinary to discover is that how Eton, the school he was at, and all his friends, when he goes into the intelligence service, I mean, basically every single person running a department and running the country and the foreign secretary is an Etonian. And so they all cling together like Japanese knotweed and help each other. So that when he gets all these wonderful reviews that he gets his Sunday Times reporters, but it sells out 4,000 copies. And so he does another one the following year, and he again writes it in 6 weeks, and that
which I feel is one of his best books. Live and Let Die. It's a really top quality thriller.
So he's still got quite a lot of stories from the Second World War. He can kind of pretend are now against the Russians, and I think what's little known is that he writes 5 books, and he's going to give up, because actually he hasn't broken through this magic. He talks about a magic sound barrier of 8,000 copies. So by the time he's written his 5th book, From Russia with Love, he goes to Jamaica and he tells his publisher, this is my last Bond, I'm not doing any more. And what happens then? The Suez Crisis happens. So he's rescued. Luck, I think, is the second ingredient. So he's got the kind of, he's got the underpinning of being able to write. He's got stuff to write about that's new, and then luck. The luck is that Anthony Eden, who was at Eton, Prime Minister, has this disastrous invasion of the Suez Canal without the American help, and it goes pear-shaped, and Eden becomes kind of catatonic, and he wants a place to kind of recuperate for 3 weeks, and so he borrows Goldeneye. So he goes to the very place where James Bond was conceived 4 years before. There are no telephones. Hurriedly installed machines have to be put under the gazebo from where Eden orders the withdrawal of British troops from the Suez Canal. So he's like a Bond villain suddenly, you know, in a small outlying thing, controlling the world, but as the world kind of collapses on him. And what happens then is that Max Beaverbrook, the owner of the Daily Express, who also has a house in Jamaica, suddenly, loving the publicity of Bond in Jamaica and Eden, puts a comic strip of Bond in the Express and serializes the next novel, and that then leaps Bond sales to about 20,000 hardback. And so Fleming has to go on continuing for another year, and each time he's continuing now, the readership is increasing, but still not kind of stratospherically. Meanwhile, Eden's reputation, I mean, anyone associated with Bond tends to come off badly. Eden is paddling around Goldeneye in a dinghy that is sinking beneath him. It literally sinks because there's a leak in it. And that's the end of his career. So Bond rises from the same waters as Eden sinks. And as the sun continues to set kind of lower on the British Empire, Bond becomes the kind of one-man Suez on whom the glow gets bigger.
So this puts Fleming on the front pages, doesn't
Put
it?
Fleming on the front page.
He becomes a sort of well-known character in Britain, but then he has a spectacular good luck in the United States, doesn't he?
So this is my favorite chapter in the book, and I nearly began the book with this, but there was too much up front, so I push it to where it properly is. It's his meeting with J.F. Kennedy in March 1960. 6 months later, Kennedy is going to be elected president. And he meets him in Georgetown with a friend called Otzi Leiter, who has been trying to get hold of Kennedy. Say, I've got Ian Fleming coming today, but the telephone doesn't work. So Fleming's with Otzi in Georgetown, and suddenly there's Jackie Kennedy coming from Trinity Church. And so Otzi winds down the window and says, oh, I got Ian Fleming here. And Jack Kennedy leans his head through the window and says, not the Ian Fleming. In another version, he's meant to say, what, you mean James Bond? So already coalescing the two. Anyway, Otzi had introduced Jack Kennedy 5 years before to Casino Royale, and Kennedy had since become a complete, passionate Bond fan. And so that night he's invited, Fleming's invited to dinner. There are only 6 people there, and an extraordinary conversation takes place after dinner where Kennedy, vexed by what's happening in Cuba with Castro, turns to Fleming and says, what would James Bond do about Castro? And always up till now, I think, this has been a nice kind of gossipy conversation that's been reported, but what actually Kennedy is saying is what would Ian Fleming do about Cuba? Because he knew that Fleming had worked in naval intelligence. He knew that just around the corner from the house they were in, Fleming had set up what became the CIA with William Donovan. He knew that Fleming, Jack Kennedy's, as I said, the father had lived on the site of Fleming's grandfather, Robert Kennedy, in Grosvenor Square. He'd actually met Fleming at a party at Blenheim before the war. There were all sorts of kind of really weird connections between Kennedy and Fleming that night. They were both womanizers. I found in Fleming's notebook handwritten the address of the woman that Kennedy was meant to have married before the war, and Joe Kennedy ripped out the marriage evidence. And so they may even have shared the same women, which is quite interesting. But what happens that night is that Fleming then tells Kennedy what he would do against Castro, and he uses all the black propaganda stuff from the Second World War that he'd set up with Donovan and advised Donovan about. Things like, scatter false currency from the planes so that the Cuban currency goes wrong. Shine a light on the sky in the shape of a cross and then say it's the second coming and that Castro is dead. These are all things he'd experimented with.
And even more outlandish things.
Then a great one about distribute leaflets to say that we're testing nuclear weapons here and that the nuclear fallout tends to get rid of beards on the bearded men. And so Castro's barbudos, they were very proud of their beards. They would all think, oh my God, we're going to lose our facial hair and the revolution will be over. Anyway, Kennedy loves these suggestions, rings up the head of the CIA, Alan Dulles, who's another Bond fan, and says, you've got to get hold of Ian. He's got these terribly good ideas. Literally that morning, the Monday morning, the CIA are meeting with Alan Dulles to rubber stamp, and Eisenhower's going to give them $13 million, to rubber stamp the campaign against Castro, which will end up, when Kennedy gets elected in November, Kennedy again greenlights the operation against Castro. They want to get rid of him. And so when you look at the following April, you look at The Bay of Pigs, the fiasco. It's all based on ideas that Fleming gave to Kennedy that night. But not only that, it's a kind of Bond paradigm, because Bobby Kennedy looks at the task force commander and say, you know, you're no James Bond. And when the Bay of Pigs is a fiasco, he says this wouldn't have happened to 007. So, I mean, the Kennedy brothers just perceived Bond as the person who saves the world, the one man. They loved all this, and they wanted to do it for themselves.
And they loved it so much that when president, he recommended Bond's From Russia with Love, and this really it takes off. And then, of course, you have the first film. I mean, I know you say in the book that Fleming always saw his books as films, and he tried again and again to get them made. And eventually, he wasn't sure about Sean Connery to start with, but then he takes Sean out with a young female friend of his, who just goes, "This guy is hot," and so Fleming agrees. And so he's now become, I think you call him the first celebrity author, and it's taking its toll by this stage. By the time the films come out, he's a weakened and sickened man, isn't he?
I mean, the curse of Bond is something I kind of find fascinating. He becomes a Frankenstein creation who strangles his own creator. And also anyone who's in touch with Bond, like Eden, and also Kennedy, suffers. I mean, one of the things Kennedy makes From Russia with Love, as you say, one of his favorite top 10 books in 1961 on Life magazine, and that has an astronomical effect for 13 million readers in America. But Kennedy is a passionate fan and this allows the films to be made. Suddenly there's a breakthrough. Fleming's been trying to make these films for 9 years, nothing happens. And suddenly, with Kennedy's imprimatur, the Broccoli's buy the rights to the Bond movies. But the curse of Bond is that on the night that From Russia with Love is going to be shown in the White House projection room, they've already shown Dr. No there 6 months before. Kennedy's now president. Some of the people who were at that dinner party I mentioned are at that projection room screening of From Russia with Love. Kennedy's in Dallas. We all know what happens then. What is less well known is that when the FBI find Lee Harvey Oswald's apartment, they find 4 Bond books taken out of the library, but one of them is From Russia with Love, which has an assassin called Donovan. And it's thought, a woman called Priscilla Macmillan, who'd interviewed Lee Harvey Oswald in Russia after he defected, she wrote a marvelous account of Lee Harvey Oswald's life, but in it she says that Donovan was so obsessed by James Bond and wanting to be an assassin like Donovan, who would be rewarded by the Russians, a smash kind of prize assassin like Donovan was, that he calls himself James as a pseudonym all that summer. So in a sense, Bond influences Kennedy, but it also influences Kennedy's assassin. And at the time of Kennedy's assassination, Fleming himself is in court being accused of plagiarizing his own work.
And this is a long court case, and it takes a huge toll. And he has a heart attack. He's told to stop smoking, drinking, and playing golf. He doesn't take advice on any of these. And then he's telling friends that actually, suddenly he's got fame, he's got a lot of money, but he would give it all for a healthy heart. And this is one of the things I found so moving. And you actually start the book with his funeral. He died age 57, very young. And then, of course, all that success was too late for him.
I mean, the funeral is extraordinary. He dies on the golf course. His real ambition, right at the end, when he's selling 30 or 40 million books, I met Algy Clough, who lived near the golf course, and he said he'd sat next to Fleming at a London club when he's a 22-year-old officer, and he said to Fleming, well, you must love all this publicity. And Fleming said, no, it's not what I want. And so Clough said, well, what do you want? So Fleming said, I'd like to be the captain of the Royal St. George's Golf Club. And so right at the end of his life, 2 days before he dies, he drives his car to the golf club where he is elected captain for the following year. And he has one day on the golf green smelling the wild garlic, and he then dies 2 days later. But he has achieved, in a sense, what he wanted to achieve, which was that.
And it's his son Casper's 12th birthday, isn't it, on the day that he dies?
This is on Casper's 12th birthday. it's thought that Fleming's decided to teach him the facts of life on this day, which is even more poignant, because probably only by now does Fleming know them. And Casper's told that, no, come and have breakfast, Daddy's gone somewhere. And he dies that night. He's being taken by ambulance to Canterbury Hospital, and he says, "I'm sorry to bother you chaps," to the ambulance people. And the funeral takes place 3 days later at a church on the edge of a house that Fleming's moved into near Swindon in Wiltshire. And it's an extraordinary event. Only 14 people are there. And they're all family. Casper's not there. They don't want the children there. And I managed to track down the last 2 people who were there, and they both told me it was an extraordinary event. I said, "Well, why?" She said, "Well, we're all there waiting for the coffin to come with the widow and from the house, and it's being brought along the bank, pallbearers, and the priest, who had obviously never read a Bond book or knew what Anne Fleming looked like, mistook Anne Fleming for the weeping sister-in-law in the front row. And at 2 o'clock, the due time of the service, he starts the service. And everyone looks around saying, "But where's the widow? My God," their eyes came out on organ stops that they were having to start the funeral. The funeral, there's no press there because the Sunday Times connections, the Daily Mail connections, but there are 2 local reporters from the Wiltshire Advertiser hopping around like detectives in the flower beds, and they report how the funeral cortege arrives 3 minutes late. But they don't know what goes on inside the church, which is that when they suddenly see Fleming's coffin and the widow, the whole service stops, and it starts all over again.
And this is for the benefit of Anne.
This is for the benefit of Anne. And it struck me that was I wanted to begin the book with that because I felt that we all know about Fleming, but I want you all to begin again, back from the beginning, and we're going to return the soil, and we're going to try and show you a slightly different person who's a kinder, more important, more significant.
He certainly, from your book, comes out as a much more sympathetic, but also sophisticated and nuanced character. And as I said at the beginning, I thoroughly recommend this brilliant biography. And we haven't got much time, but it would be great if we could just take a couple of questions.
I'd like to know what happened to the son Casper. You said he was wounded.
Yes, I kept this to the end. Casper was bipolar, and I think bipolar, I discovered, is a hereditable disorder. And I think so many of the contradictions that I was perceiving in Ian Fleming, I mean, everything you can say about him, you can say the opposite. You can say, women hated him. I've never met a man who women loved more. He hated art. He loved art. I mean, I've got a collection of, everybody says different things about him. And that's quite an indicative thing that he had so many contradictions in himself that it was very difficult for the biographer to make sense of this until he realized that possibly this was an element in Casper's makeup too. And Casper becomes obsessed by guns, becomes obsessed by antiquities. He digs up ancient battle axes of stone in the fields. He's a very precocious boy, very popular, very clever. But I think that the pressure of having a father so famous at school, and he had guns at Eton, he kept a Sten gun under his floorboards, and then he's expelled from Eton because he has this gun. And then his uncle, Peter Fleming, who's his kind of godfather, you know, this great war hero, he's almost Peter Fleming's last kind of sad moment is that the police discover that he's kept Casper's Sten gun down the well, and Peter Fleming has to appear in court and is fined £10. And that's the end of his kind of career, so to speak. So, but Casper basically inherits Goldeneye when he's 21, and he tries to kill himself there when he discovers that his father had had an unhappy marriage and was in love with this woman, Blanche Blackwell. And he goes out to sea, he's saved, and then right at the end he takes pills, and he's 23 when he dies. I mean, it's a tragic life.
We've got time for one more question. Gentleman there.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. I would like to ask Nicholas, sir, what are your top 3 Bond books / movies? And also, what was Mr. Fleming's relationship with like his Bond actors like Sean Connery, Roger Moore, and of course George Lazenby, if possible?
He only knew Sean Connery, but he dies in '64. So he thought originally, my God, this man is an uncouth Scottish working class kid. But as soon as he sees the rushes, and both of us have spoken to Chris Blackwell, who now owns Goldeneye, who was watching the rushes in Jamaica of Ursula Andress coming out of the water. Do you remember in Dr. No? And Connery's singing whatever he's singing, Under the Mango Tree. And they're watching the rushes, and Chris Blackwell says everybody knew suddenly it wasn't a B movie, this was a movie, and they ring London and get more money to finance whatever they needed more. And so I'd say he turned, in answer to your question, he basically after that, he gave his Bond character more Scottish blood, based on Connery's background.
All right, thank you very much.